You see the difference? How a deadly badass villain became a mere joke. Marvel has had a bit of trouble with making really cool bad guys.
Look at me. I'm such a dick.
Since they started making these movies back in 2008, the villains haven't been as awesome as the heroes. But the question is it still a problem now, even after some villains like Thanos got a lot of love from the fans? If yeah, then why is there such a big villain problem in the MCU? Back when it all began, the bad guys in the first set of movies were pretty good, especially at the start. The fights between heroes like Thor or Iron Man and the bad guys were pretty damn interesting. The actors they picked for these roles were really great, I mean, superb to be honest, but the problem was that as the movies reached the end, the fights between the heroes and the bad guys became a bit basic. They were more about looking cool rather than having a real story behind them. The villains became a bit too much like cartoon baddies, which didn't make them as interesting as the other movie villains, but the original villains from the comics weren't this bad. Plus, a lot of the bad guys were too similar to the heroes. They had powers or backgrounds that looked a lot like the heroes they were fighting. Like Obadiah Stane was a business version of Iron Man, or Red Skull had powers similar to Captain America. This made things a bit boring and didn't really create exciting fights. But back then, these movies were mainly about making these heroes more popular. Characters like Thor and Iron Man weren't huge superheroes at first. Marvel took a big risk by making movies about them and wanted to make them as good as the big names like Spider-Man or Batman. So they focused more on making these heroes look great rather than diving into the villain stories. The problem got bigger in the second set of movies because of the Avengers. It was a massive movie with many heroes fighting a big battle, so the focus shifted from small personal fights to huge battles. Other movies tried to copy this, but it meant the main villains were not shown much and were less important. Their screen time dropped a lot compared to the earlier movies. The time the villains got in Phase 2 was way less, and even when they appeared, they mostly just showed up for fights or to explain things. They didn't get to have a real connection with the heroes, or have a good story. The actors who played these villains even said they were not happy with how their characters were treated. But things changed in Phase 3. They started to give a lot more time and depth to the bad guys. For example, Thanos got a lot of attention, and was a big deal in the story. He wasn't just a typical villain. They showed why he wanted to do what he did, and fans even started to understand and support him.
They called me a madman, and what I predicted came to pass.
Other Phase 3 villains like Killmonger from Black Panther had strong reasons for what they did. They weren't just purely bad characters, they had layers. So, is it still a problem? Well, sort of. Marvel is trying hard to make better villains now, but it's more about heroes in their movies. Still, they've made progress in making their baddies a little more interesting lately. But Phase 4 seems to be a bit of a mess. They've introduced new villains, but it feels like they haven't given them the same attention as before. They've started to focus more on TV shows as well, and the quality of the movies seems to have dropped a bit. People might not be as excited for the next phase. The new villains in Phase 4 haven't been as impressive as the older ones, like Taskmaster in Black Widow. Instead of being a cool, tough bad guy, they made Taskmaster a different character, which didn't work well. Gorr the God Butcher from Thor: Love and Thunder was okay, but didn't live up to what fans expected from the comics. Even the Scarlet Witch's storyline in Doctor Strange 2 was a bit off. They made her a villain, but it didn't really make sense given her character's history. Especially after watching Thor: Love and Thunder, where everyone was hyped up about the movie, but divided on whether it nailed its goals. We need to have a chat about one key character causing a stir: Gorr the God Butcher. In the comics, Gorr is a big deal, a favorite among fans for being a terrifying villain. But when the movie portrayed him, many felt something was off. Christian Bale, the actor behind Gorr, did a stunning job, no doubt. His history on playing seriously disturbing characters like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho was on point. But here's the catch: Gorr didn't get enough screen time, and that seriously lessened his impact. He felt underdeveloped, not as menacing as he's supposed to be. You see, Gorr's thing is hunting down and slicing up gods. In the comics, he's taken out loads of them, even tormenting King Thor for centuries. But in the movie, he only offs one god on screen, and that scene didn't quite capture how brutal and ruthless Gorr is supposed to be. In the comics, the aftermath of his attacks really shows his lethal power, but in the film, he seems more like a nuisance than a genuine threat. The main issue with Thor: Love and Thunder was mixing two amazing comic storylines together. They put two top-notch stories in one movie, causing both plots to fight for attention, and in the end, both lost their punch. It's a bummer because each story could have made a great Marvel movie. but by merging them, we got an okay one instead. In the comics, the battle between Gorr and Thor gets really personal. Gorr loses an arm to Thor early on, creating a burning desire for revenge. In the end, he fights 3 different versions of Thor, making the whole thing intense and epic. But in the movie, that personal touch was missing. So the showdown didn't feel as grand, and Gorr ended up feeling way less interesting than his comic self. Let's shift gears to another villain, MODOK. Now, in the comics, MODOK is a seriously dangerous evil genius, but when he was brought into Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, he became more of a laughingstock. He was this quirky, dangerous villain turned into a silly punching bag for the heroes, and not in a nice way. The movie turned him into a joke, straying far from his comic book image. Originally, MODOK was supposed to be a big deal in Marvel's first Iron Man movie in the 90s, but plans changed, and after several attempts in different Marvel movies and series, he finally appeared in Quantumania. However, the way they portrayed him, especially his look, didn't quite match his original character. Instead of a menacing threat, he was used as a constant punchline, erasing the weight of his backstory and turning him into a running gag. Now, MODOK's backstory in the comics is pretty dark. He was a real menace, driven by rage and a need for respect, but in the movies, they made him switch sides suddenly, which undercut his whole character and turned him into a joke. The whole thing was quite disappointing, especially because his potential as a serious antagonist was totally wasted. It's not just MODOK who suffered this fate. Take Corvus Glaive, a chilling and impactful villain from the comics. In the movies though, he got lost in the shuffle. What was supposed to be a terrifying figure turned into just another henchman, losing all the gravitas and horror he held in the comics. Clearly, Marvel's villains are losing their edge in the transition from comics to the big screen. They're getting turned into jokes, or losing their depth, and that's a real shame. Fans are missing out on the potential for some seriously great bad guys in these movies. It's cool to see new adaptations, but it's equally important to keep the essence of these compelling villains intact. If they continue down this road, we might end up missing out on some seriously epic showdowns between heroes and their nemesis. Marvel need to bring back the bite and depth these villains deserve in the future. That's the only way to keep the superhero stories thrilling and exciting. Take Taskmaster from Black Widow, for example. Fans were super excited to see this cool character in the movie, but they ended up feeling disappointed. So, why was Taskmaster such a letdown? There's a bunch of reasons actually. First off, the way they used Taskmaster in Black Widow just didn't feel right. In the comics, Taskmaster is a dude named Tony Masters, but in the movies, they made it this girl, Antonia Dreykov. That change didn't sit well with a lot of fans. The trailers made Taskmaster look so cool, right? They showed all these awesome fighting skills, but when the fans watched the movie, Taskmaster did hardly anything. It was a letdown because they didn't use the character's unique abilities, like mimicry and tactical skills. What's even worse is that Taskmaster felt more like a tool than a real character. She hardly spoke, and her role just wasn't developed enough. Fans thought she'd be this big deal, but she was kinda just there. And making her a puppet controlled by someone else, well, that felt a lot like the Winter Soldier story, which Marvel already did. Another problem was that Taskmaster didn't seem to have a clear future in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After the movie, it's uncertain if the character will even stick around. That's a bummer for fans who are hoping to see more of Taskmaster. So, why did they use Taskmaster in the first place if they weren't going to do justice to the character? It feels like they wanted a familiar name to attract fans to the movie, but it ended up not working out so well. But hey, Taskmaster isn't the only Marvel character to get the short end of the stick in the movies. Ultron, Obadiah Stane, and Ronan also got kind of a raw deal compared to their comic book versions. Ultron in the comics is seriously menacing, but in the movie, he's not as scary. Same goes for Obadiah Stane, who was a much bigger deal in the comics. Ronan too was way more interesting and complex in the comics than what we saw on screen. So yeah, Taskmaster's letdown was part of a bigger problem in the Marvel movies. Sometimes they don't do justice to these awesome villains and characters from the comics, and that's a real shame for us fans who love these stories. Like Ultron, the metallic baddie with a serious dislike for emotions, in the movies he's a bit, well, kinda predictable and not so scary. But in the comic books, he's a lot scarier. He's all about wiping out emotions and trying to turn everyone into machines like him. Scary, right? Then there's Obadiah Stane, who's a big deal in the Iron Man comics. He's super cunning, playing mind games with Iron Man, framing him for stuff, messing with his business, and even hiring a spy who pretends to be his girlfriend. He's a seriously dangerous enemy who chooses to end his own life rather than face justice. Jeff Bridges played him in the movies, but they didn't dive deep into how wicked he is in the comics. It was a missed opportunity. And Ronan, the blue guy from Guardians of the Galaxy? In the comics, he's way more interesting. He's all duty-bound, doing bad stuff because he thinks it's the right thing for his people, the Kree. He even fought alongside the good guys sometimes. There's this whole heartbreaking love story he has to give up for his duty. But in the movie, he's like a cheaper version of Darth Vader, not the cool, intriguing character from the comics. The problem here seems to be that these cool villains from the comics don't always turn out as awesome in the movies. They sometimes feel a bit watered down or less frightening. The stories don't go as deep as they do in the comics, which is a letdown for fans who know how great these villains can be. So, while we love the Avengers movies, it'd be super cool if they made these villains just as awesome and scary as they are in the comic books. Imagine how intense that would be on the big screen.